Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling and also through rewards for your donation, like a getting started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit. Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. This is a particularly how do we embrace the bliss and the grit kind of episode. The holiday season's still a recent memory, and we all got a good dip into family personalities and patterns. Usually when we're on a spiritual path and we touch into the old family programming, or really any time that we bump up against the more gristly bits of life, it often brings up the questions like, what is the point of these practices that I'm doing if I can't meet this with some of the more stereotypical images of the spiritual person? Why can't I be the unruffled person, or the perfectly equanimous one, the endlessly compassionate one? Is it possible that the more challenging aspects of life are supposed to affect us a lot, to touch our hearts very deeply, to hurt even? Why do we make suffering, both our own suffering and other people's suffering, a problem, rather than just part of our alive nature? What we may not realize when we begin these practices is that the root question of the spiritual path is actually, are you going to live or not? Are you really willing to be alive? And instead of some magical finish line that you cross and you become the good spiritual person, perhaps aliveness is its own ongoing reward, even in the challenging times. If you're enjoying the show, we would be delighted if you left a review on iTunes or on our Facebook page. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe. We send out a weekly digest of the resources that we're currently loving every Friday. Or, as you may have heard in the brand new intro to the intro, this week we are excitedly announcing our new member platform, which has a lot of goodies. You can check those out at patreon.com/blissandgrit. Last thing, those of you who are new here and haven't gotten the memo yet, sometimes Vanessa and I drop the occasional F-bombs. So, if you need headphones, go grab them. Okay, here we go. Hello, Vanessa.
Hello, honey.
So we're back from holiday break.
We sure are.
Both on the show and in our lives. Yeah, sort of. And a repeating theme that's been, coming up, probably I'm not alone in this, is that as I talk to people about their time with their family over the holidays, people are expressing to me how much grief they felt in particular about the way they see their parents living out their lives. That there's this heartache. Why are they so stuck in their habits? Why are they so stuck in the way they nitpick at each other or wear this mask of this particular habit or things like this? So on the one hand, there's heartache about witnessing family patterns, what it looks like, 20, 30 years down the road. And then on the other hand is this question that I've had multiple people ask me in the midst of these conversations, which is, am I going to turn out that way? Which I think we've all had that concern or that thought. To which my answer is like, well, no, first of all, we're not them, but also we're having these kinds of conversations because we're curious and inquisitive and interested in the way we meet life, which does not mean that we're emptying out all the badness in us so that we can attain some perfect state. It's just that we're genuinely curious about the way we relate to life and the way life relates to us. And like in these conversations, one of the constructs I saw, which we've talked about before, but I think it's worth bringing it up a little bit more highlighted, is that we still have this idea that what we're headed for is peacefulness, or life lived as a cloud, where we, the image of sitting under the Bodhi tree and that we're untouched by life, that we don't feel heartache when we encounter our family or, go through something in our own personal lives. And so how can we be in their presence and only experience life as a cloud, or how can we deliver to them peacefulness so that they don't keep headbutting whatever wall they typically headbutt?
And so that we don't have to feel distressed because they're distressed. Exactly.
So that it doesn't push our pressure points. And, we're not the only ones coming off the holidays with families. So I think that this is a pretty alive conversation. And I want to frame it a little bit, that the interest that, because you and I spoke before the conversation, that we both have is not so much like the Festivus airing of grievances, right? Although fun, that it's not so much like, why are they over there like that, as it is that we want to kind of inquire about this image of the peaceful one, this image of the still silent one, and how some of our practices and constructs and teachings can walk us down that road where we believe we should be delivered that, or be able to deliver it to others, and where that gets tricky.
Yeah. I think this has been up for me in that sort of unformed way that it's up, right? Like kind of swirling thoughts and feelings, just mostly recently, but it began a while back when I found my friend Clint in Sedona, who I later led a retreat with. Because when we went out into the land together, and Clint was adopted into the Lakota tradition 30 years back almost now, and so practices Native American spirituality and earth-based traditions. And when I went out onto the land with him, he was praying to the Creator. And it was the most unusual and wonderful thing to witness, which is very funny to say. I grew up in a Catholic tradition. Of course, we prayed and you pray out loud, but this was different. It was like how a prayer might sound from Clint would be like, Creator God, help my sister Vanessa. She's feeling really down these days, and she could use some joy and some merriment. So bring that to her heart and make her feel glad and look out for her family. And Creator God, like I'm going through some stress. I'm going through some stress about work. And so if you might support me and help me know I'm loved, and so on and so forth. And then they would drum and he would sing and we would dance. And then he'd say, okay, Vanessa, it's your turn to pray. And I'd be like, I'm just used to being quiet in my head. Right. And there's this like weird, almost shyness or trepidation about being out loud. And I thought that was interesting, and I've been meditating for years, and meditation is such a silent thing and such a peaceful thing. Right. And I felt this kind of, I don't know if internal divide's not the right word, but this internal exploration around this, like almost this hesitation on my body's part to like sing out loud and pray out loud and stomp out loud. And this movement towards, no, the way I connect with God or life is through absolute stillness, and only that. And years ago, did you ever read Zorba the Greek? I mean, I know I talk about it, so yes, I must have talked about it.
And you've also given me multiple copies. We used to share them back in Brooklyn. So yes, Zorba the Greek was a part of our early foundational friendship.
For all of you listeners, one of the secrets of Vanessa is she loves Zorba the Greek and The Last Temptation of Christ. And why I love it was because the author, Nikos Kazantzakis, was going through this exact internal exploration. He had a deep draw to Buddhism, probably the Zen tradition. And he would wonder to himself through his writings, what was more profound or what was more spiritual? To sit in a room staring at a wall, as is the Zen tradition, meditating in silence, or to be out in the world, kind of like living full force, drinking in everything that life had to offer you, jumping up and down, dancing in gratitude, screaming out to the ocean, praying at the top of your lungs. And I was always fascinated by it. So recently, I've been exploring this. And of course, given who I am, when I explore this, the kinds of questions I wonder is, what does it mean to be human? Like, what is the point here of this manifestation that is human life? Like, what's the game we're playing? And what are we pointing ourselves towards? Is it an exalted state to be ever at peace? Like nothing ruffles you anymore. Like you just almost barely care is the image that we used to get, right? Or, you know, you're so peaceful and you're overflowing with compassion, but that's it. Complete non-attachment. You don't really care what happens. And to me, you know, when I've been working with clients since Christmas, having gone through my own holiday kerfuffles, as you would say, you know, and I have clients who are like, maybe they're looking to move or they're looking to make a change, or they were dealing with their parents' upset and they're like, well, they're thinking I'm not supposed to care, right? Like my parents have hurt feelings, or my parents are in these places where they're stuck or non-alive. And I'm supposed to be very zen about it and kind of above it. And I'm not supposed to care, right? Because to care would be to be codependent. And I'm like, maybe you're supposed to care a lot and still do it anyway. Maybe you're supposed to care a lot, but not drown in it. Maybe you're supposed to care a lot. And that what we're unhooking is not the tendency to care that other people are suffering or to be moved in this alive manner, but rather to unhook the little hooks that say, I can fix someone's suffering, because that's untrue. Or it's bad if someone suffers, and I should make sure they never have hurt feelings, and all those tiny little hooks that aren't true. But maybe the aliveness, the way that life moves us and impacts us is, after all, the whole point. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I just said a lot.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Good luck. Ball lobbed to the other side of the court. I was thinking about what you're saying about maybe we're supposed to care a lot, you know? And I think that one of the other aspects of this is there's all of us here doing our thing, living our lives, and we get to see how other people live their lives, including those very, very close to us, like our family members. And it's almost in some ways, like if we want to make it a little simplified, it's like looking at a menu of human life. You know, like if I were to talk with somebody who has a very high stress job that they hate, that they work 110 hours a week at, I would see that on the menu of life and I'd be like, yeah, no thanks, not for me. And with our family members, it's so much more intimate than that. It's so much more closer to the bone. And because of that, it's also all of the wiring that we have in ourselves, ways that we can go, ways that we can relate to life, because it's exactly what we've been shown and patterned after. And so in some ways, it's like we can see these things that we find very heartbreaking, ways that they operate. And it's like this menu offering, like, would you like it? You know, and we can say no, you know, and we can still have broken hearts for them. But in many ways, I think that these things, they're in our lives so that we see them. They're in our lives so that they touch our hearts and so that we can have a different kind of awareness about them. And so I think a part of what you're pointing to is so sweet and so hilarious, right? Because we can endlessly talk about the path and our practices and all these different things. And really, like, what is the game we're playing here? It's called being a human being who's alive. And like, we're all entitled to our fuck ups, and we're all entitled to our heartbreaks, and we're all entitled to our choices to do something different than that, and our joy. And like, that's it, you know? So the end game isn't, unruffled. There is no end game. It's just this ongoing, gorgeous exploration. Like, I was watching, I'll put the link to the video. Matt Kahn did a talk recently on happiness that I've watched a couple times. I found it really powerful. And at one point, he was talking about how he used to be afraid of everything because life hadn't properly devastated him yet. And then once he had been repeatedly and very profoundly devastated by life, then he, you know, it broke him through to this different way of being. And it just struck me, you know, he didn't say this, but what occurred to me is like, as a person who identifies a lot with her own healing journey, and as a person who also has a bunch of codependent wiring, I can make things like devastation, heartbreak, mistakes, whatever you want to call them, regret. I can make them mistakes, you know, problems to be solved. But in so many ways, like, we're all entitled to our devastation. It's a part of what comes through for each of us. We have a right to it. It's our beautiful human life. And we're all entitled to our heartbreak towards those as we see them devastated, and we don't want them to hurt, and we wish there were a different way.
Well, I think also perhaps part of the dilemma is this thing that we do where we make suffering a problem rather than just a part of the human experience. You know, we don't want people to have hurt feelings. Like, hurt feelings? Who cares? And I don't mean to say that callously, although the words sound that way, but, you know, that's part of our alive nature. We live and we lose. We love and we surrender. It's all a part of this human journey. We don't get out of that, right? And being hurt or being upset, as you know, as I know, as I think all of you listening know, it's also motivated us to some of the most amazing things in our lives. I think it's interesting lately, for some reason, it's coming into the foreground of my attention when I speak with clients and they feel like, oh, not this again. I wish I just knew already. How do I not choose that bad partner? Or how do I get out of my own way to be as successful in my career as possible? Or all of these different things. And of course we don't want to suffer, you know, and I think that's a very sweet, tender, precious part of ourselves that doesn't want to suffer. But at the same time, I'm like thinking, well, maybe it's part of it that you don't have all the answers yet. You know, like Buddha had this moment where he was, you know, living this princely life, completely sheltered from all pain and suffering. And then he saw someone aging, and he saw someone dying, and he saw people hurting. And he went off on this, like, I don't know how many years, 10 to 15 year long journey where he suffered a lot. He had a lot of internal anguish. He suffered physically before he found his enlightened state. And Jesus Christ has a similar story. And if you look at people we may revere who have lived in our lifetime, I look up to people like Nelson Mandela and look at his journey. And, you know, you're talking about Matt Kahn talking about devastation, and almost everyone will have a story like that. So I think to myself, where did we get this concept that if we're struggling, if we're confused, if we're stuck, if we're in pain, if our hearts are touched by people who are in agony, where did we get the concept that this is less spiritual or less wanted or less divine, less sacred, right?
Yeah, I mean, what if nothing's a problem? including our heartbreak, including our desire that, oh my God, I wish I were over this pattern already. What if none of those things are a problem?
That's what I'm thinking. And if we were to begin to see it through that lens, okay, it doesn't change the heartbreak, right? It doesn't change the ache. You know, my beautiful, lovely mom was bouncing pain bodies faster than someone could bounce a paddle ball off a wall. And understanding that there's nothing wrong with my heartache doesn't necessarily make my heartache go away.
Right.
It's still there.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a thing that we are prone to doing where I feel the heartbreak and then I say, I shouldn't have this heartbreak. It's bad that I have this heartbreak. This heartbreak is too much for me. This heartbreak is codependent. You know, I'm not responsible for her feelings. And so I start to make it into a problem that I'm having a heartbreak rather than a sign of my own aliveness, rather than a sign of something sacred and profound and beautiful and ever so human, something to work with. I mean, in the way that we could honor the elements, in a way that we could honor this human journey. That's what I mean by work with it. I mean, put it in ceremony, you know, put it in prayer, put it in song, put it in dance, so that as soon as we can start to come from the angle of maybe my own suffering and confusion and human experience are not a problem, but rather the whole thing, the whole journey, the whole point. Maybe when we can come from that angle, all of a sudden openness happens, right? Because there's no resistance anymore.
Yeah. It's funny, when we were talking with John Prendergast in our last episode, one of the things I wanted to bring up at the end, but we were like a little tight for time, you know, is that when we really do what we're describing here and what we talked about with him, where we don't reach for the self-improvement project. How can I be a better and better version of myself? And we also don't reach for the transcendental project. How can I live like a cloud, you know, that's unaffected by anything? And instead we find this real, true lived experience middle way, which is as simple as just whatever your human life looks like at any given moment. But really contacting it in a very genuine way, which I think John did a very nice way of leading us into that. What are we left with? And I would say that the thing that our separate self balks against the most is that what we're left with is, when we really land in that place, is a certain kind of contentment. And contentment is kind of the wrong word, because what I don't mean is like the sort of half sleepy smile, sort of blissy. And I also don't mean happy, like I'm so glad that I'm watching my parents suffer miserably and loathe each other. Contentment is like nothing to get grabby with.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing to turn your back on, and nothing to wish away, including wishing things away. Like, this hurts so much, right? I'm allowed to say it hurts so much, I wish this weren't here anymore. And that kind of contentment that's what really landing in our lives looks like. And so one of the things I want to kind of circle back to a little bit that you brought up in the beginning is, if that's what the path is like a really genuine contact with our actual lives, not the self-improvement project, not the transcendental project, not making things go away. What are our practices for? And I think it gets confused because from our cognitive selves, we look at them from the outside. Like, if I looked at a room of Zen monks meditating in a room, if I looked at a picture of that, I would go, oh, the practice is for sitting still and being peaceful. Or if we were going to look at indigenous traditions, I would say, oh, the practice is for praying to the ancestors. Like, you can kind of keep it on that very surface level, and it keeps you trapped from the real depth of it. And the depth of all practices is to land you in a human life. So in the example of sitting still in a room and meditating, we're not doing what a lot of secular mindfulness marketing involves right now, which is like, how can I quiet my mind and be more productive? And everyone's heard me complain about this so many fucking times that I won't walk down that road too much. But point being, what we're trying to do is we live in a culture and we're so conditioned to be racing along from thinking that we're separate selves and from our thoughts that we don't have really time to contact the field of aliveness. So when we're sitting still in meditation, we're not trying to bliss out or be peaceful or stop our mind from thinking. We're trying to give ourselves the opportunity to contact the field of aliveness that everything emerges out of. And, you know, we can take that in a million woo-woo ways when we talk about it with words, but the actual experience of it, I would imagine, is quite a lot like the experience of going through, more indigenous practices like you're talking about, praying out loud to the ancestors, dancing, singing. They're trying to make contact with the alive field, so they look quite different, but same. And if we keep them in their little boxes just based on what they look like, we think that it's almost like we're acting out certain hobbies, but we're not. We're trying to come into our alive experience.
Yeah, you're making contact with what Jeannie Zandy would call like the vibrating field of aliveness.
Mm-hmm. Or Judith Blackstone would call fundamental consciousness.
Yeah. The other day, someone was talking to me about falling in love and how do you open your heart again after you've been hurt? And I think most people have some way of relating to this, these sort of armors we have from opening up all the way. And that can be on every level. It can be allowing ourselves to fall in love. It can be allowing ourselves to be seen, allowing ourselves to exist, allowing ourselves to care with every inch of our heart, because it's also vulnerable, because at the same moment, we're very well aware of loss. We're very well aware of the risk to our safety physically and psychologically. So to me, when someone's wondering, how do I let go and love again, even though I've been hurt, it's like a question of how do I allow myself to live, And I think it's a really interesting and potent question. Are we ready to live?
Mm.
And I imagine that many of us start things like a meditation practice because something's really hurting. And we just are aware of wanting something different, wanting a different experience, needing something different, needing not to hurt so much. And what we may not realize in that movement is that for many of us, it's this way that we don't know how to live without being subsumed by the suffering of life. Mm. Like we don't know how to come into direct contact with aliveness, which includes all of the bliss and all of the grit, right? All of the beauty and all of the crazy, as we say. We don't know how to do that. We don't feel we have the capacity or the skills or the support to do that. And so we're getting subsumed by our own pain or our own fear. And what we don't recognize is that it's kind of a question of, are you going to live or not? Really? Mm. Or are you going to fall asleep to life and walk in these kind of sleepwalker patterns, or allow your pain bodies to start to call the shots, your habitual movements to call the shots? One of the reasons why I love the indigenous traditions and I find myself called to them, and I found myself called to Reggie, who really lovingly integrates Buddhism with indigenous wisdom, is that for myself, I think there's a part that has always longed to just go to sleep. Go to sleep. Don't feel anything. Numb out. Have always been on a very deep kind of cellular level at odds with the idea of being alive. because of this, because of the risk, because of the vulnerability, because of the pain I've felt, right? And I think in a way, I don't know how to describe this. It's almost like the medicine is in exactly what we fear. Like aliveness has its own implicit reward. It is the thing, the most potent, meaningful, significant thing. Yet we're so afraid of it. So we kind of turn that faucet off and we go into the world of concept and we try to set up our life and our goals and our strategies and determine what will make us happy. And we fall in love, but not too much and not with the wrong person. We hedge our bets, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And it's like we keep missing something that like will make it all worth it. You know, will make the risk worth it. Will make the fact that we're going to lose who we love worth it. We're missing it, but we don't realize that we were the ones who turned off the faucet. So then we may go and sit on a cushion, which I still recommend. But what we don't realize in the background is that the movement is towards keeping that faucet off, keeping the calm, keeping the peace in a way that's not in direct relationship with aliveness. So I see it very easy to do. And where I think some of the dilemma is that when you're on the cushion, and if that mechanism to turn the faucet off is really functioning in you in a big way, you can run into the problem we actually also spoke about with John, where you're in meditation and yet you're no more connected to life, capital L, than you are walking around, right? You're no more connected. And so when I have spent time with indigenous practices and people devoted to them, there's something unbelievable about losing yourself in a moment, about the kinds of dances and trance states and ecstatic moments and singing and stomping and dancing that is a celebration of life. It's almost like you can't have your faucet off and be shaking a rattle and jumping up and down and singing to God. Right? It's almost like antithetical, right? Which is part of why it's always been scary to me. There's a surrendering of that armored, protected state that says, I'm just going to keep it all together. I'm going to keep it all together. And I don't know, recently, as I have fallen in love with the practices and teachings of John Lockley, who is an African Sangoma or healer, medicine man, the most beautiful practice I think he has is listening to your own heartbeat. And there's more to it. You can dial into that if it calls to you. But because your heartbeat is your aliveness, it's like surfing the wave of your breath and your heart and your blood and your bones. And it's this very deep reminder and reverence for the fact that we're fucking alive.
Falling in love is such a great example. So I want to kind of come back to that a little bit because we've all been there and we've all totally been there where we were like, if I'm just more careful or if I just don't give as much of myself, it won't hurt as much if and when it ends. And we all can look in the rearview mirror and know that that is utter bullshit. You know, a heartbreak and loss of a loved one always hurts. It always breaks your heart. No amount of turning off the faucet of how intimate you're going to be with that person protects you. And I would say, and I think we can all look in our own histories and trace this, I would say that the more that we did that, the more that we tried to protect ourselves or prepare in advance or, you know, hedge our bets or whatever, that the more it hurt because we never got what we wanted, which was an experience of like intimacy and aliveness with people. And so we cut ourselves off from the life flow by trying to protect, and all we get for it is more hurty. We get the opposite of what we wanted. We don't get the connection to flow. And so I think that that's, you know, important for us to like go back and take a little gander at in our own lives.
Well, it gives a certain amount of insight to this same experience around being alive, because it's exactly the same thing. We're kind of hedging our bets. We're using the analogy of playing the game of life. We're very strategically setting up our lives sometimes. We don't quite realize that on a conscious level, but we are like, okay, I'm going to invest in this and not too much in that, and I'm not going to take this risk. It's like, for example, when I was very afraid of being trapped in relationship. I have a very deep fear of engulfment. So, but I really wanted love. So unconsciously, the way that I solved that problem was I would choose men who have a deep love of freedom, even bigger than me, because those people never trap you. So then I'm hedging my bets. I can get the love, but I'm not going to get something that's going to engulf me. So I'll stay safe. But ultimately, what always wound up happening was that it was lacking that level of safety and intimacy I was truly craving. Mm-hmm. And so this is what we do. I know about a month ago, Brooke and I were about to record, and you and I were talking, Brooke, about what we were going to record on. And it was right before the holidays. And I think I was talking about like the unwillingness to live, suicidality and all of these things.
Wanting to die. That's right. You texted me. What about wanting to die? I was like, that's a really cheery holiday episode.
So finally I get to talk about it.
You got your wish.
Yes. But, I have noticed within myself and within many people that I talk to that we can be remarkably skeptical about being alive. Mm-hmm. Remarkably skeptical. It's actually not unusual for people to have things like suicidal ideation, which are suicidal thoughts. But moreover, when I went to grad school, we used to play this little game, is probably not the right word. We would do this little experiment with ourselves where imagine that you're standing on the ground and I was to draw a line in the sand, so to speak, in front of you. And I was to tell you as you're standing on one side of the line that on the other side of the line was life. And that if you would just step over the line, you would be born into life. Can you get the picture? Mm-hmm. And I remember all too clearly being very hesitant about stepping over that line and having clients feel the same way. And that's a really interesting thing because on one level, I don't want to die necessarily, but I also don't want to live. It's kind of like what Adyashanti would talk about when he speaks about that fist in the belly, the existential no. Mm-hmm. And it's like a big old fat no to death, but a big old fat no to life. Yeah. Because, to be alive means things change. They're out of your control. They're not predictable. You're going to lose things, and you're ultimately going to lose your physical body and the bodies of those you love in some way, shape, or form. And so, we're kind of straddling this weird line as humans.
It's purgatory. It's totally a purgatory.
It's kind of hell on earth, you know? Mm-hmm. If you're aware enough, which every one of you listening is aware enough, that it is uncomfortable to be stuck in the world of concept and not experience in an every single moment basis that life is utterly sacred and meaningful and profound and beautiful. And that is every moment of it. Right. The ones where you're sad, the ones where you're happy, the ones where your heart's breaking. Like, Brooke, I think back a lot to an exercise you offered in one of our recordings in December, where you said that you imagine like you're 80 years old and look back on that moment.
Mm-hmm. That your 80-year-old self gets to be transported to the present moment and live it again.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that I want to necessarily go through my heartbreak again, but wouldn't there be something so profound in looking back on that moment?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't it be so personal and important and rich and like amazing to think back to being that 30-year-old who felt utterly in despair and yet had this glimmer of hope beginning to peek through your heart. Like, these are the things that make life life.
Mm-hmm. And you can have so much affection and admiration for even the hardest things. I think in part in that exercise, because it's like, you survived it, right? Because like, that's what fear says is I won't survive this. Like, it's over for me. But the only thing we don't survive is constricting our own access to life. And I don't say this from a place where I'm nailed it. You know what I mean? Like, that's why we have these conversations. It's a ongoing process where we get to keep coming back to life. And honestly, I would say like, it's such a, compassionate way that life interacts with us that it allows it to be a gradual unfolding, that it allows it to where you get to, test out, well, how does it go? Like if I'm falling in love with someone and I really let myself fall in love, like I really let it in. And John brought that up too in our conversation, which I thought was so great. Like when you have these moments of landing or of realization, really let them in. I think that there's a way that we can be like, okay, good, got it. Like, but what if I really like this person. I really hope it works out, but what if instead it was just like really feeling in your body the sensations, which can be huge when you're falling in love, like, and can feel overwhelming and like anxiety sometimes. And also very blissy and very delicious. And what if you were just like, yeah, fuck it. Like, I'm going to do it. Really curious to see what happens if I'm just like all in. And, at every other time my heart got dashed on the rocks. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume that'll happen again. I'm not going to like do it so that I get the prize at the end where my heart doesn't get broken. I'm just going to assume, the heartbreak part's going to come too. But I would guess that there's so much affection, like that 80-year-old self being able to come back in a certain way for having really said yes to something. And in what we started with, in the example of like witnessing the lives that, people in our families choose and them being things that might break our hearts, that we can really say yes to that. That we can really be sad and heartbroken and frustrated and confused and concerned for ourselves and just be like, this is what life is showing right now. It feels like this.
I think we can disregard the significance of meaning. Oftentimes we'll talk about happiness, as a culture, we'll try to be happy. And we may seek for meaning in terms of purpose, like what's my career and what's my calling and things like this. But I don't know that we have a very clear experience of what brings us meaning in life. Aliveness is a meaningful experience, not by any concept. It's not laid out by the brain like, it's really meaningful. It's like experienced as right, as wholesome, as natural, and as multidimensional and meaningful to be really alive. And you can think about your peak experiences in your life. I mean, I can draw back on being on retreat in Sedona and meditating together and then praying together and then singing together and then dancing together and then connecting with the land. And that really, it enriched and enlivened my experience of being a human being in a way that it gives me greater capacity to hold whatever pain and suffering is also coming through this container, right? Because this vibrating field is filled with all of this richness of human experience. So I think we oftentimes forget that the meaning is found in our aliveness, and we are doing that thing I mentioned about shutting off, kind of the hose. But then we're walking around with this existential angst. So I just think it's a really important and interesting question for all of us. Like, how are we going to live this human life? You know, I swear, I mean, gosh, I'm in my 40s. I've been meditating forever. It's amazing to me that I still am asking myself that question, like, what makes it worth it? You know, what gets me up in the morning? What makes me eat so that I stay alive? Like, what is it that makes this all feel significant and worthwhile? I think it's a really interesting and important question to be exploring. And then allowing the answer to come through in a very direct way.
Yeah. And not from a cognitive, right. Exactly. Because we always answer those questions from the lens of concept, and we're still left wanting. Yeah, I was listening to an On Being interview today. Of course, I cannot remember his name, but I will put it in the show notes. But he was a Christian monk. And she asked him what he thought of world religions as institutions. And I thought it was such a great answer, but it makes me think about what you're saying too about enriching the aliveness. And he was saying that he felt like all world religions were kind of like volcanoes, that at one time they were just spewing red hot life force all over the earth. And then at some point they hardened and stopped up, and they became rocks. And anyone who would just walk by them would just see this big, tall, hard rock-like thing. And they wouldn't know that at some point it was spewing forth fiery life, you know? And that how can we find ways, he was talking about in our, you know, religions, if we affiliate with a religion, whether, you know, Buddhism or Christianity or what have you, to tap back into the magma, you know, to find the aliveness and to carry that forward into the world, you know, by being alive beings who realize the interconnectivity of all things. And it was a really gorgeous conversation. And, you know, I think that it's normal if we're all a volcano, it's normal that magma is going to become rock-like in certain places. But how can we be curious enough to like keep tapping into it? Not because it has to have this kind of mighty explosive force, but because aliveness is powerful and is there, and it is the whole thing.
I love that. That's a great explanation. I guess it's important to put in a little caveat towards the end of the conversation, that sometimes aliveness can be confused with drama.
Yes.
It can be confused with adrenaline rushes. And everything I'm saying now is not to be in judgment of those things. Wonderful. You love jumping out of a plane, go for it. You know, you're in a dramatic relationship, it happens. You know, so none of this is to be in judgment, but we can confuse what it means. You know, ultimately, with aliveness, in the way that we're talking about it, it's almost like truly being human, which means being open to all of the elemental forces of nature as they are, without resistance, without having to groom them or manicure them. Like my theme for this year, for 2018, that had just occurred to me, I don't do this every year, but it was rewilding, because we have all been domesticated, even in the way that we think that the desk in front of me is a solid object. That's a form of domestication. It's a conditioning. And we have been our throat chakras are shut down, so we don't feel entitled to screaming and singing out our prayers. And we have been conditioned to make things under control. And peaceful and groomed, and to revere that above states of chaos and destruction. And so this sort of act of aliveness, it's not to even make things exciting, because that can be another form of just conditioning.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
one of my favorite forms of bypass historically. I could tell stories.
Mania. That's one of Brooke and our songs, because we do it so much.
Yep.
And I have met many people who use drugs and alcohol, and again, I'm not in judgment of it, but as a way to not be alive.
Absolutely. And to do the like big, explosive, high drama, you know, like that is a bypass too. It's a way of not contacting what's actually happening.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is being in direct contact with our experience, which is the heart of the kind of Vajrayana and embodied meditation paths that we're always speaking about. And very much a part of some of these beautiful indigenous paths where you're aiming to strip away some of the domestication and the conditioning so you can experience the sacredness in the vibrating field around you. And my goal has just been to be able to meet that more and more in my life. So even outside of these ceremonial moments or these moments of quote unquote practice, you know, how can I welcome? I had this dream the other day that someone had ripped a palm leaf in half, like a reed kind of in half. And they said, yeah, like, yes, it's all one, but the whole point of life is to find your way back together. You know, so this idea that we have that we should have been born and we should know our purpose and we should know what's meaningful and we should know how to make ourselves happy and we should already be at peace and
clear all of our karma.
It seems to me like it's skipping the whole point, perhaps, that the whole thing is to be in this mystery and this chaos and this, you know, swirling, vibrating field, and to organically and beautifully and slowly and profoundly discover the truth of it all.
Mm-hmm. Just to experience it is so sacred. It's the whole point. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. If you go to the website and scroll down, you will see each episode's separate post and the resources within those posts. Our member platform is new and is at patreon.com/blissandgrit, where you can donate to the show and you also get rewards for your support. So if you're wanting to engage in these topics in a deeper way, it's a really great place to go for a more immersive experience and also just to get more support for your path. You can also come play with us, of course, on Instagram and Facebook, or subscribe on the website, blissandgrit.com, if you want our Friday digest of what resources we're living. Many of you have also written kind reviews, which we are very, very grateful for. Here's one from Deanna Clark. I found these two lovelies 6 months ago and always look forward to their yummy insights. They claim to be just two girls on a spiritual path, but I think they are both pretty freaking awake. Just listen, you'll see. P.S. Warning, may become habit forming and cause extraordinary bursts of love and laughter. Thank you, Deanna. We're so grateful. And we're all pretty freaking awake to be here, I think, engaged in these dialogues. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week.